Brutal hostilities are continuing in Israel and Gaza following a surprise attack by Hamas militants on Saturday that left hundreds of Israeli civilians dead and has led to severe retaliation. To discuss the issue, we spoke to the Foreign Affairs correspondent David Pratt, Amy MacKinnon, a reporter at Foreign Policy magazine, and the historian at Aberdeen University, Dr. Alessandra Cech-olin. Alessandra, it's clearly a very complex situation, but as briefly as possible, what's the root of this conflict in Gaza?
Well, I think it's important that we look back at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to understand what is going on in Gaza right now. And we can go as back as 1947, when the UN accepted the Arab-Jewish partition plan for Palestine, and Gaza and the surrounding territories were actually allocated to the Arabs. With the establishment of Israel in 1948 and with the first Arab war, the Egyptians occupied Gaza as a sort of headquarters where they could control the offense against Israel, and Gaza remained under the Egyptian military rule until 1967. And the Six-Day War really plays a big turning point in the history of Gaza, also because we need to understand that this small strip of land was populated by Palestinian refugees who could not go back to Israel, could not receive a compensation by the Israeli government for the loss of the territories, and they also could not become Egyptian citizens. So again, up until 1967, Palestinians lived in squalid social condition and also economic condition. And between 1967 and 2005, Gaza was under Israeli occupation. And really the turning point is 1987 with the first Intifada, which in Arabic means shaking off. And this is when we see the birth of the Islamic resistance movement, also called Hamas. And this is very much a kind of showing how political Islam worked for the Palestinians in Gaza.
David, this seems to be on a completely different level to anything we've seen before, is it?
It is, by and large, John. I mean, I covered the first Intifada that we heard about there in 1987, and the second Intifada as well. And I visited the country, Israel and Gaza itself, the West Bank on regular occasions. And I can think of some very, very volatile periods during that time, not least during the Intifadas themselves. But this is on a different kind of scale. The level of sophistication in terms of the military planning, the operation, the numbers involved, the audacity of actually Hamas moving from Gaza en masse into Israel proper is completely different from what we've seen before. So yeah, it is on a different scale, and I think most analysts, commentators would agree with that.
And Amy, it seems to have happened just as Israel was beginning to attempt to normalise relations with some of its Arab neighbours. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, this was a project which was spearheaded by the Trump administration, accumulating in the Abraham Accords, which was a normalization of ties between Israel and a number of Arab majority states, and a project which was very much continued by the Biden administration. I mean, one of the things which we've been hearing about very recently until this weekend was efforts by the US to broker a normalization in relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, in an effort which was seen by some as kind of skipping over the question of Palestinian statehood, skipping over the question of the future of the Palestinian people, to move beyond that and to kind of build more normal ties throughout the region. That, of course, has all now been thrown into question by events over the weekend.
And Amy, there's some suggestion that Hamas will have Iranian support, and is this maybe what Iran's looking for?
Well, that's certainly one of the things that the Biden administration and Israel, of course, is watching very, very closely, would be any efforts by Hezbollah, certainly, to open a second front in the north. That's one of the top priorities that the US is tracking at the moment. They've sent an aircraft carrier strike group into the region as a display of support for Israel, but also as a signal to anybody else in the region to stay out in the coming days and weeks ahead.
So we've seen horrific images and reports over the last few days, David. What do you expect is going to happen now?
Well, to all intents and purposes, it looks as though we're looking at a major ground operation by the Israeli Defence Forces. And, that's fraught with problems. I mean, if you think about it, since Hamas took over Gaza in 2007, there have been 4 wars between Hamas and Israel. And everything at the end returned to a kind of untenable status quo, despite the bloodshed and the fighting and the carnage that involved. And I think we're looking at another major, sort of invasion of Gaza. And this time it's going to be doubly tough because there are hostages being held by Hamas. Also because I think Hamas has had time to prepare and dig in much, much more effectively than they have in the past. And also I think to some extent, the Israelis are smarting a little bit. They're still in a state of shock almost in that way. And I think it will be, incumbent upon certainly the military command there to try and sort of get things settled down a little bit as this bombardment continues before they move into there. It's every soldier's nightmare going into an urban environment like that. And Gaza, with its infrastructure, its dense population and the buildings and the destruction there, will make for very, very tough fighting indeed. But I think that's where we're heading. But when that's over, at some point, Israel presumably is either going to march out or they're going to have to loot to govern or occupy the place, And therefore, we'll be back to square one. We'll be right back to where we were. I thought it was interesting what, in Alessandra's kind of précis there of the origins of this. But in many respects, you could really simplify it right down to that the real core cause of this conflict is the longest occupation in modern history. I think that's not an unfair kind of assessment in that way. There are lots of historical labyrinthine details there, but that's really what it boils down to.
So given all of that, Alessandra, can peace ever be achieved here? I know it's a big question, but there has to be an end somewhere, you would think.
Well, I don't think we can talk about peace right now, but I think once this war is ended, there will be a heavy blow to Netanyahu because all the narrative about Israel to be invincible really has been proven to be, has been challenged by this war because it was unexpected, it was a shock, and it has been compared only to the Yom Kippur. So I think this is going to open up also a debate within Israel, also regarding the future of Israeli politics and also the future of Netanyahu. And I think, of course, if you ask me, perhaps the only solution at the moment is a one-state solution because only one democratic state for both the Jews and the Arabs can really solve the situation, given the fact that the Palestinian territories are politically and territorially divided.
And Amy, you were concurring with that. Is that very much the view from the States?
Well, the view from the States at the moment, we heard from President Biden a few hours ago. He delivered a very forceful speech flanked by the Vice President Kamala Harris and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. One of the more forceful speeches I've seen Biden give in his tenure as president. He really reiterated unwavering U.S. support for Israel. The U.S. is already sending rockets over to help Israel replenish its Iron Dome missile defense system. But what he didn't do, however, was offer any attempt to put guardrails on Israel's response, which is, of course, what everybody is looking for now. As David alluded to, there's the prospect of a ground invasion of Gaza in the coming days. And that's going to be something I think interesting to watch play out here politically, as presumably and tragically, the death toll is likely going to mount in Gaza, and what will probably be very bitter fighting is whether Biden is able to continue to maintain that unequivocal support for Israel, or whether he's going to try and coax Israel to pull it back, to come to the negotiating table, and whether he's going to face pressure from within his own party, of course, because there is the left flank of the Democratic Party, progressives within the party, who are moving away from the long-standing position of unwavering support for Israel, which has been prevalent in the US in recent decades.
And David, a fear over the scale of what the Israeli reaction might be, but presumably this seems to have been so well planned by Hamas that they will be expecting some sort of retaliation. So,
I don't think for a moment that they would have engaged in such an operation on this scale without factoring in all the sort of military and political implications there. And they will have contingency plans for that. I mean, Israel is a military superpower in that sense, certainly in regional terms. So in the end, in military terminology, it's almost inevitable, of course, a victory comes Israel's way, albeit a Pyrrhic victory in that sense, But I think the most important thing here to remember, there's two things. I thought it was interesting what was said about the political problems that lie ahead for Netanyahu, because I frankly think Netanyahu's political toast after this. He was running a very, very fine line. We saw the demonstrations, the mass demonstrations in Israel over the whole supposed judicial coup and the whole issue that was going on at that time. And, Israel is a fractured place. This is a man, Netanyahu, that actually, 15 years ago promised to topple Hamas. In effect, what he's done is toppled segments of Israeli society. So I think there's recriminations coming. I think when things are over in Gaza, many Israelis, will turn their attention to unfinished business.
And there we will leave it. Thank you very much. David, thank you. Alessandra and Amy, thank you both for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.